The 1960s in America were chaotic and filled with disputes and violence due to the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War. NASA and the Apollo program brought people together in an effort to beat the Soviet Union in the space race. America triumphed by winning the space race and landing on the moon first. Although there were tragedies in Apollo 1 and 13, the long-term advances in technology and increased concern over the environment overshadowed these events.
After World War II, the Soviet Union and the United States entered what is known as the Cold War. Both countries started creating rockets. Each country was trying to build bigger and better weapons. They were focused on building nuclear weapons and ways to deliver them. In order to launch long-range missiles, they would need to know more about space. They also knew getting into space would be important. This led to the space race. The idea of man walking on the moon distracted people from all the terrible things that were happening. NASA and the space program brought the nation together in a time of crisis and war. The Soviet Union was the first country to get a person into space. Yuri Gagarin went into space for nearly 2 hours. Alan Shepard was the first American into space 3 weeks after Gagarin, and his flight only lasted 15 minutes. The Soviets were the first country to orbit the Earth. They also had the first spacewalk. America was losing the space race. The Americans had to beat the Soviet Union to the moon. President Kennedy knew how important this was for the United States.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
In 1961, President John F. Kennedy announced that America would land on the moon before the decade was out. Immediately, America set to work designing the Apollo 1 spacecraft. On January 27, 1967, Gus Griscom, Edward White, and Roger Bruce Chaffee were testing the rocket to prepare for the actual mission. They reported that there was a flame on board. While the people outside were trying to rescue them, an explosion occurred. Soon the hull of the spacecraft was torn open by heat and pressure. The crew couldn't get out. They were dead in minutes. This tragedy sent NASA back to work to make improvements to make sure that this type of accident would not occur again. By October 1968, NASA was ready to try again to send men to space. The Apollo 7 through 10 missions were all tests to prepare for the moon landing. They had a few problems, but it went well. Now, after all that testing, it was finally time to send a man to the moon. The Apollo 11 crew included Commander Neil Armstrong, Lunar Module Pilot Buzz Aldrin, and Command Module Pilot Michael Collins. Their target was the Sea of Tranquility.
9. Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
The flight was calm until Armstrong called out, "Program alarm." The worried men were reassured when they heard the mission could go on. It was just an alarm for overloading data in the computers. On July 20th, 1969, they triumphantly landed on the moon and became the first men on the moon.
I'm going to step off the limb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Columbia.
Following the triumph of Apollo 11, NASA would send 6 more crews to the moon. Each crew was able to further study the moon and bring back samples of rock and dust to Earth. Only Apollo 13 did not land on the moon as planned. The mission started on April 11, 1970 with astronauts John Swigert, Fred Haise, and James Lovell. 2 days later, 200,000 miles from Earth, Oxygen Tank 2 exploded. This caused Oxygen Tank 1 to fail. As they realized something had gone wrong, Swigert said the famous line, "Houston, we've had a problem."
Houston, we've had a problem here. And say again, please. Houston, we've had a problem.
13 minutes later, Lovell looked out the window and saw some sort of gas leaking outside. The astronauts survived the mission by moving into the lunar module. They orbited the moon in order to get enough speed to travel back to Earth. When they returned safely to Earth, everyone breathed a sigh of relief. Apollo 17 launched in December of 1972. It was the first mission with a real scientist, Jack Schmitt. He was a geologist and always very busy. This mission was also historic because it was the last time that a human walked on the moon. In 5 years, NASA had sent 6 successful missions to the moon, and now the lunar missions were done.
The immediate impact from Apollo program was people coming together to support American progress and success. Over 600 million people watched the moon landing in April 11, 1969, but after this accomplishment, people did not think that the Apollo 13 was necessary. This was the 5th mission to the moon and the 7th manned mission in space. America had already won the space race and mastered the technology to travel in space. People thought that the government was spending too much money on space explorations, and they wanted to shut NASA down. On the day of the Apollo 13 launch, the Honolulu Star-Bulletin had a headline stating, "Is this moon trip necessary?" After the disaster, America came together and prayed for Apollo 13 and the crew. Even though Apollo 13 did not land on the moon, it was the most carefully watched mission on the whole space program. People all over the world followed the story on TV, on the radio, and in the papers. Pride in the country was at an all-time high.
The first mission for the Apollo program was a very tragic event. On February 21st, 1967, the men of the first Apollo mission died before they even left the Earth. Then, 3 years later, NASA had its second tragic event when the Apollo 13 spacecraft exploded in space. Despite these tragedies, many technologies sprang out of the Apollo program. One of the more remarkable changes was the fact that the computers went from being the size of a room to being the size of your lap. To be able to land on the moon, the crew needed to make small adjustments on the lunar module. They needed small and reliable computers on the ship. MIT suggested they use a new technology called integrated circuits. NASA bought millions of microelectronic components to do this. Although we would have eventually created personal computers, former NASA flight director Glenn Looney said,
"We were asking people to do things that were probably 10 or 20 years faster than they otherwise would have done, and they knew it. They stepped up to it and succeeded. Today's cell phones, wireless equipment, iPads, and so on are a result of the fact that the country did this high-tech thing and created this large portfolio of available technologies."
Another surprising thing that came out of the Apollo program was Earth Day. After Bill Anders took the famous picture called Earthrise in 1968, people realized how fragile the Earth was.
That picture is probably the picture of the century. We thought we were going there to study the moon. No, we went to the moon, we learned a lot about the moon, but most of all, we learned about a new way to look at the Earth.
Having that unifying experience, I think, was a very profound and moving moment for people on Earth. To realize we're all on this one spaceship together, we better start taking care of it.
John McConnell saw this photo and printed it on flags and t-shirts and handed them out in New York. He asked people to be more aware of the Earth. His actions helped lead to the creation of Earth Day. Today, Earth Day is celebrated in 175 countries. It works to end air pollution, water pollution, and encourages recycling and reducing waste.
At a time when American morale was low because of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, civil rights battles at home, and the ongoing war in Vietnam, the Apollo program by NASA brought the American people together through the triumphs of having a successful lunar orbit and landing the first man on the moon. Although there was tragedies like the loss of 3 men during Apollo 1 and the accident in space with Apollo 13, the long-term technological advances and increased awareness of the environment were triumphs that impact our lives even today.